Hello, everyone, and welcome to Camping with Lenny. In this episode, what do you do if it rains while setting up your campsite? This episode is brought to you by me, Camping with Lenny. Help me create great content by supporting this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/campinglenny. Thanks for your support. So you decided to go camping and you got to the campsite and it's raining. What are you gonna do? Well, I'm gonna tell you how I do my setup while camping in rain, or just before it rains, or during the rain while I'm camping. I actually do one thing before I leave to go camping. I actually check the weather report. If the weather report says that it is going to rain, what I do is I actually check what time it's going to be raining, what time does it end, or if there's a break. I try to set up my campsite, especially the tent portion of it, while I have a break during a rain forecast. That will give you a fighting chance to make sure everything's still dry. But you can't really help that. Mother Nature is Mother Nature. It rains, so it's just chaos. So what I normally do is I actually set up a tarp. Before I do all that, before I set up my tarp, I actually check the campsite first. I look at the campsite to see where's the highest point versus where the lowest point is, and gauge if I actually fit my tent there. If I can, then what I'll do is I'll actually set up a tarp first. The tarp can be anything. It can be a lightweight tarp that you design for camping, or you can get a tarp from where you get from a hardware store or an outdoor shop. And those blue tents, those not disposable, but those blue tent, I normally string them along in the trees as much as I can, or I have a tarp pole that I can actually use to set it up, so at least it's ready to go. I make sure it's big enough that I can actually put my tent underneath it. So typically when I do that is I usually bring two tarps with me. One is just a general tarp that's for emergency purposes. The other one's a proper tent tarp, that's the lightweight one that's actually very durable. It's easy to hook up, easy to set up, and those kind of things. So I bring multiple tarps. What I normally do is I set up the tarp where my tent's gonna be. Set it up in a way that's like high enough that I can set up my tent underneath it, and in the same time too that it's gonna keep it dry, relatively dry. The second tarp I'm gonna be using is where my quote unquote the kitchen's gonna be. If you know where the area that you're gonna be setting up your kitchen, or where you're gonna be sitting on or eating at, I put another tarp there. That will give me a fighting chance of eating and cooking and hanging out in a dry area. You don't want to set up in an area that's like wet. It's just going to be a very miserable time. So I set up those two first. So I'm guaranteed I have it'll give the ground enough time to drain and to dry up as well too. So that's done. I set up my tent underneath my tarp, where I'm gonna be putting my tent. Is that first thing I'll do is I actually put a footprint or another tarp. The goal for that footprint and a tarp is to give that moisture barrier between the ground and the floor of your tent. You need that barrier. You need that separation, because if you just put your tent on top of a wet ground, moisture will seep into your tent and the whole tent will get very, very wet really fast. And I guarantee you're going to be a very miserable person if you're set up in a puddle or a potential puddle. So having that tarp will actually give that moisture barrier between the ground and your tent. So that's a good thing to have, right? After you set up your tent underneath your tarp, then you have two options after that. Adjust the your tarp, your shelter tarp, so you can actually make sure it angles backwards, so when it rains more, it actually beats away from your tent or away the area that you'll be sitting on. the entrance of the tents for definitely, because you don't want rain going into that. It's just going to be muddy. So try to redirect the rain that collects on top of your tarp away from the area that you'll be sitting on or entering your tent, so that will at least keep it dry as possible, right? Set up inside your tent all as normal. Again, the tarp is there to keep the rain out. Now, the fun part, the kitchen or / the hangout area. If you do have an awning, it's not an awning, sorry, a gazebo with screens, this is perfect. So you can set that up underneath one of the tarps and have to move it away. So you have another shelter that's actually waterproof. Waterproof. Then at least you can do whatever you need to get done there. But if you have a tarp on top of your kitchen area where the picnic table is, or where you want to cook at, location wise, that will give you the ability to prep your meal, play cards, play games in relatively dry area. You don't want to do all that during the wet because it can be very, very miserable. So I'll give you an example here. Last year, the latter part of last year in my camping season, it rained. It rained when I left the city. It rained while I was going to the campsite. It rained while I was in the campsite. The only saving grace I had a 2-hour window to set up my tarp, set up my tent, and set up my area that I'm going to be cooking at and just relaxing. Literally, sorry, I just bumped the mic. That was literally my 2-hour window that I have to do. So what I did is I set up the tarp, I set up the tent. Then after the tent, I set up the tarp first with my poles, make sure that's tight enough, then put my tent underneath it, then set that up. Now, if it rains, at least it's gonna not make my tent wet before I put my fly up, right? The goal is to make sure that you set up your tent dry, right? And I do have some photos. I'm gonna put the photos on right now so you guys know what it looks like. That at least that will give you a fighting chance to make sure everything's dry. For the kitchen side or the recreational side or the games area or your prep area, I normally try to set up as much as I can on top of the picnic table as much as I can. The reason why I do that is if there is a wet area or if there's somewhat of a flood or water accumulating on the ground, at least everything's off the ground. You don't have to worry about anything that's being wet. If you have wet gear, wet bags, wet everything, it just makes your camping trip a lot harder. So the goal is to make sure everything's set up properly, your tarp set up properly, set up underneath the tarp, find where high ground is. Then at least you're gonna have a very great time camping in the rain. And now, to be honest with you guys, what I've been seeing is everyone loves camping in the rain because of the soothing sound of the rain. I like it too, but setting up and tearing it down and packing out is just a very miserable time. So I try to avoid it as much as possible, or try to minimize the wet equipment that I bring back with me. One more thought: when I go back home with wet gear, first thing I do the day when I get back is actually I open my tent and all the tarps that I use. I actually dry it up underneath under the sun as much as possible. If I have to wait the next day, then I'll do it the next day. But I'll try to open it up, let it sit underneath the sun, fully set up. My tent will be fully set up, except the fly. The fly will be somewhere else in the ground. Just let it dry. As soon as you do all that, you can repack everything and get ready for your next adventure. So that's how I deal with wet campsite, and that's how I set it up. If you have any questions, leave your comments. Talk to you guys later. Thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, consider supporting this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee. Link in the description. You can also visit campingwithlenny.com. There you can find other episodes and links that can help you on your next camping adventures. Thanks again.